we would start with our first keynote of today. As I already said, Sean Randolph from the Bay Area Council Economic Institute, and he's mainly working on collaborations between the Silicon Valley and other innovation systems in the Bay Area Council. And he's also looking at the dynamics that other innovation systems have to the Silicon Valley. And one questions we have on Sean maybe is if we need maybe here in Stuttgart a kind of Silicon Valley. So we had yesterday the quote from the CTO of Trumpf, who said that we are a kind of Silicon Valley for the manufacturing industry. So it would be very nice to see your thoughts on this topic and your perspective from the Silicon Valley to Europe. And come on stage. We are very lucky to have you here.
Thanks very much, Mark, and thanks all for being here this morning. Really appreciate the work that has gone into organizing this conference by Mark and Guido and all their teams. Terrific job. You have a wealth of people here at this conference from the west coast of the US, and I'm obviously one of them. I'm going to try to bring a short perspective on a question that we get a lot of conversation with European colleagues on, which is about the connection between Europe and Silicon Valley, meaning the Bay Area, through startups. And why and how is it that so many hundreds of technology startups come from everywhere in Europe every year to the Valley? So we were asked to take this on by the European Commission last year to give them some metrics and some indicators for just what that dynamic looks like. And there we go. So first of all, why is the question even being asked? Well, from a European Commission standpoint or any European perspective, Europe has lost a lot of ground in the last 10 years in the technology space. There's a lot going on, but relative to advances, say, in China, Asia, and the US, Europe has lost some ground. In 2006, 17 of the most valuable companies in the world were European. Today it's 7. Europe's share of major ICT companies has been falling back relative to the US and Asia. And if you look at billion-dollar plus valued startups, especially in technology, currently about, I think, 139 are North American, about 83 are Asian, about 44 are European. So the perception is Europe has lost ground in the last 10 years, and how do you make it up? Well, there's a lot of ways to do that, but one way that governments have chosen, including the European Commission, but virtually all the national governments, is to support startups, because Silicon Valley has really excelled at creating young companies that grow very, very fast, very dynamically. Typically, they can pop up and expand hugely in 4 or 5 years. Europe less so. So can Europe actually do the same thing and create high-value growth companies by supporting entrepreneurs? So first of all, it's a very dynamic scene. I think you all know that. We find that the major cities, the major clusters for where entrepreneurship is growing fastest are, number 1, London, but also Berlin, Paris, Amsterdam, and Stockholm. They have the numbers, the facilities, the connections to industry, where just in numerical terms, this is where the action is most concentrated, but it is not only there. There's a host of other cities across Europe. Those are just a few, and I apologize if your city is not on the list. There are a lot of cities that could be on the list that are also really dynamic places and have really become scenes in the last 4, 5, 6 years. Very often that is due to a particular dynamism or synergy between the entrepreneurial sector and key industries that are based there. For example, if you look at Berlin, it tends to be really strong in creative industries. However, Munich is really, really strong, especially in things relating to engineering and manufacturing, which is not so strong in Berlin. Or you could look at Eindhoven in the Netherlands, that's really strong. Guess who's headquartered there in Eindhoven? It's Philips, and they're really strong in engineering-based startups. So a lot of different competencies across Europe in both larger cities and smaller cities as well. So mirroring that, where are the largest startups concentrated? We'll call them scale-ups. These would be companies that have about $100 million or more that they have raised. And same story, if you throw in Spain as well, France, UK, Sweden in particular, and Germany. And you can also measure the same way dollars raised. You can see a similar pattern. Of course, if you lump the Nordics all together, you have a pretty critical mass there in the Nordic region as well. So virtually every government in Europe has taken on its own strategy about how to support technology startups. Typically, it's going to be some combination of tax credits, usually around R&D. It's going to be around grants for startups, usually very small but significant grants for early stage companies. And most European governments are investing in venture funds, typically co-investing with private investment firms. But the European Investment Fund is actually extremely strong, remarkably so from a U.S. standpoint. They directly account for about 10% directly of all venture capital in Europe, and their funding leverages about 40% of all the venture activity today in Europe. So a big commitment at the national level, but a very, very big commitment also at the EU level. So there's some challenges. Why are they doing that? Why do they need to do that? Well, one of the big issues is that there is not enough venture capital available yet in Europe at the right kind of level. So for the most part, there is plenty of early stage startups grants. There's plenty of angel investment, no lack of that. And there's a pretty good amount of Series A funding. The problem comes when you start to get to larger scale funding, to growth capital, Series B, especially Series C. The more volume of capital is required for growth, the more scarce it becomes. And you can just see the numbers sort of dropping progressively as you get into that kind of higher funding space. Some other issues out there that startups face. One is there's limited access to stock markets. If you're going to do an IPO outside of London, there aren't a whole lot of places you would go. If you want to be acquired, about 50% or so of all the tech acquisitions happening in Europe are done by American companies of European startups. Another factor is the relatively small scale of European venture firms. Typically, they have about 20% of the scale or funding available as a typical U.S. venture firm does. And their investments individually tend to be similarly much, much smaller, which again gets you into that question of is it Series A or B or C or something else? And also, I know there is an exception to everything I say today. You could probably think of 10 right now. But for the most part, the people who are the partners in the venture firms are coming out of large companies or banking. In the U.S., it's a little bit different. They're typically former entrepreneurs who have started multiple companies and succeeded. And it's just a different kind of perspective that they bring. But I think in Europe, one of the consequences is their investments tend to be more conservative, a little bit less bold, not aiming quite as much for the transformative changes. So this is kind of reflected here. You can see the composition of where the money in the European firms comes from. Big, big role of government. In the US is overwhelmingly private. So again, sort of a different character and a different perspective in terms of where the money's coming from and reflected to some degree in how it's directed. So the good news is this is getting better. When I first looked at this maybe 3 to 4 years ago, it was a pretty static picture. The last 3 to 4 years, there's been a lot of momentum growing in Europe on these fronts. There is more capital available. There is more later stage funding available across Europe now than there was before. There are more successful entrepreneurs who have founded companies and are now themselves becoming venture investors, and more successful entrepreneurs who are now willing to mentor early stage companies, all of which is great. It's not a solved problem yet because, in fact, the amount of the funding, even though there's more later stage money available, is still a lot less than it is in Silicon Valley or the US. But nevertheless, really remarkable, important advances in all these issues in the last, I'd say, 3 to 4 years. There's some other issues. These tend to be particular to individual countries. One, though, is market scale. And a lot of this, when I'm talking about startups, it's based on many, many conversations with startups that are in Silicon Valley from Europe, startups in Europe, mentors, investors there and in Europe, and people running accelerators in Europe and in the US. And one question is scale, that even the larger European economies don't have the scale of the US. If you have or you still have a lot of cultural and regulatory barriers in Europe that make it expensive to do business on a European basis if you have limited resources as a startup. In some countries, labor law is a factor, harder to hire and fire people in a dynamic way you may want to as a startup or may need to. Some countries, taxes are a factor. Just generally speaking, these are more cultural regulatory issues on the national level, but they tend to make it costly to grow or difficult to really sell and develop your business at the European level. So Silicon Valley, what's the connection there? What role does the Valley play today in this whole dynamic? Well, there is a really remarkably large infrastructure in the Valley, and when I say the Valley, really San Francisco, Silicon Valley, the same thing here because they've largely merged, that organizations, both governmental and private, that provide support to these small early stage companies with the objective of making them successful. So there are more European governmental offices in the San Francisco Bay Area than anywhere else in the US outside of Washington and New York. And you can see quite a range. We've got a lot of consulates. The interesting thing about them is, in contrast to a lot of the US, a major part of their job is helping startups, being technology bridges between their country and Silicon Valley. There are a lot of national governmental technology offices that are there to facilitate technology connections, including helping startups get connected in the Valley, and it's even going to the subnational level. And the European Institute of Technology, EIT Digital, has a very active office there, focusing especially on the digital economy. There are a lot of accelerators. There are a lot of accelerators, period, but there's a significant number that are purely European. They may be sponsored by European governments. They may be sponsored by a combination of European governments with private sector partners, and some are just purely private sector. For example, the Belgian Chamber of Commerce operates a really dynamic, terrific accelerator right in the middle of San Francisco. Then there's these large accelerators. They may have, 60, 80, 100 companies at them or more that are not European in nature. But when you look at where in the world are the startups in those accelerators coming from, in every case, the largest segment is coming from Europe as opposed to Asia or anywhere else. Then the European Business Organizations. So these are all binational, and most countries will have these. Cities will have these. But again, like the consulates, like the governmental presence, all of them have a focus on startups. It's not the only thing they do, but they all have as a major part of their mandate how to connect and introduce startups from their countries into the Silicon Valley environment. And sometimes they all kind of combined together, Silicon Vikings, which I love the name. It's all the Nordic countries together working to do exactly the same thing, and they actually support one accelerator that brings all the Nordic countries together at one facility. This is where I think it kind of gets interesting, the corporate presence. So we talked yesterday in some of the breakout sessions about large European corporations, corporate accelerators. I've counted about 50 large European corporations across many, many different sectors that have innovation offices in the area. That can be a dozen or two, up to hundreds of people. And typically they're doing several things. They are interpreting Silicon Valley back to their headquarters. They help them understand what's going on there because they need to understand it. Maybe pick up some of the culture. They're bringing leading executives through periodically to see if they can kind of tune into the Silicon Valley way of thinking of the trend. Very often they are partnering with large companies. Maybe it's Google, maybe it's Intel, whoever it may be. Very often they're partnering with universities. And what they're also doing, what they may also do is if you're a company, say like Spotify, and you run on a platform like maybe Facebook, you're looking to develop relationships with those big platform companies that help you expand globally. And they're also looking for startups. Even the biggest technology companies that have large R&D budgets of their own realize very often startups are innovating faster than they can. And so they're not walking away from their own R&D, but they're actively searching, pretty much every one of them, for startups, European, from China, from the US, it doesn't matter where really, that they can support, maybe acquire, maybe incubate, that can help them advance their business model. And you can see it's every industry you can think of just about. It's not just tech companies, it's automotive companies, it's retail companies, it's a pretty wide range. And guess what? They have venture arms. Those venture arms may be co-located or part of the innovation offices, or they may be separately organized, but there's a really large and growing venture presence by these European companies. So again, why do these young companies come? Basically, they're accessing growth capital. It's not the early stage. They've got the early stage capital. It's the growth capital primarily. If they're thinking about IPOs, it's a place to be. If they want to get acquired, their odds are probably better of being acquired than anywhere else that they could go to. Scaling is a big issue for all of them. They're looking to scale into the US and globally. Partnering with platform economies and also platform companies, they're also looking for mentors and looking for seasoned partners. So there's a lot of people in the Valley who have started companies multiple times. They have global experience doing that. They have the marketing background, and they're often looking for those kinds of people to bring into their organizations. What do they find? Well, as I pointed out earlier, the infrastructure is very supportive. There's lots of help available for them. It's a very open environment. You actually can get access to very high-level people relatively easy. You're introduced around from person to person to person. Doors tend to be pretty open. There's a large pool of risk capital available. A lot of investors tend to think big. So if you're thinking big, that opens doors. What they also find, though, is it is really expensive. It is the most expensive place in the United States to locate and run a business. Everything is costly. Housing is insane. And so that's the factor, and also intense competition for talent. It's a huge pool of talent, but people are jumping engineers between companies constantly. They're expensive, and if you're a young startup coming in from another country, you're competing against LinkedIn and Google and Facebook and many other large companies with large benefits. So the competition for talent is extreme. But this is interesting. How do they grow? If they actually succeed, what happens? Typically what happens is that, and again, there's all kinds of variants on this. If they're successful, the founder team or one of the founding team may move to the US, may move to Silicon Valley. They may put the corporate headquarters there, or they may not. They may stay at home, or they may split the leadership between two countries. But even if they do put the headquarters in the Valley with a European subsidiary at home, the fact is the roles are complementary. What they do in the Valley tends to be accessing the capital, the growth capital, the global scaling, and the marketing. Typically, almost all the engineering is done at home. If you ask them where are your engineers, they're in the country they came from, or they may be from all across Europe. And that's because, guess what? The engineering talent is just as good here. And also, it's a lot cheaper. So you don't have to deal with that high cost and competition for talent. So very complementary roles. If they don't leave the home country, they tend to actually become many dual national companies. So how can we make the bridge stronger? The system, I think, works pretty well for everybody. Something's going on, the digital single market, that can help potentially create more of a pan-European market, more so than there is now. GDPR may be an issue. It's a cost factor. Compliance for smaller companies, we'll see how that works out. Privacy, the duty of care here in Europe, again, a risk and cost factor for smaller companies. We'll see how that works out, but both things that could inhibit growth in Europe. Data localization, same kind of thing. I've talked to startups that say, hey, where in country X we'd like to go into Germany or we'd like to go somewhere else, but it means we have to put our data on their server. We can't do that in all these different countries. It's expensive, so we're just going to go to the States. So those are factors. Capital Markets Union, can Europe create a pan-European venture capital market? That would be really helpful. Most venture firms tend to, except for maybe the UK and parts of Scandinavia, tend to invest in their home countries. Is there a way to scale that so that a startup anywhere in Europe could have reasonably good access to venture capital from anywhere else in Europe? That would be a good goal. And then some of these national tax and regulatory policies are more at the national level. So I think the final point here is, well, on our side, what we're seeing is the accelerators are focusing now, the national government ones and the private ones, on somewhat later stage companies. The early stage companies they found were kind of getting oriented and educated, but they weren't showing a whole lot of results in terms of growth. So now a lot of these accelerators are focusing on companies that have a little capital already at home. They already have a product or close to having a product. They kind of know what they're doing. Now they're ready to scale. And I think we're seeing a shift toward those somewhat later stage companies coming over than the early stage true startups we saw at the beginning. I think there's a big opportunity for accelerators from Silicon Valley to expand in Europe now. There's so much talent, there's so much opportunity here, there's so much synergy with Europe that rather than sitting back and saying, hey, come to us, why don't we come to Europe? And we're seeing that as a small but a growing trend now with a lot of our major accelerators now establishing facilities across Europe, some in partnership with major European corporations, which is a pretty natural way to go because they have partners and anchors in Europe who really know their industries very, very well. And at our end, a startup visa would really help. I hear again and again from startups from everywhere, it is really hard if you want to stay more than 3 months to get a visa to do that, especially if you want to get a company off the ground and raise capital. So that's on us, given our immigration policies right now in the States. I'm not holding my breath anytime soon, but it's something we need to do. So the bottom line, it's a two-way relationship that I think delivers a lot of value on both sides. Silicon Valley gets constant infusions of energy and talent. That's just great. It's connected to the rest of the world through all of these people who come through or often stay for long periods of time to start companies. Europe gets companies that are growing faster than they would have probably had they just stayed at home. Companies that get more capital, and actually these companies typically create more high-value jobs at home than they do in Silicon Valley. So that's a plus. And I think finally, this illustrates the kind of role that Silicon Valley plays as a global innovation platform. The question has come up, should Stuttgart or other cities try to recreate Silicon Valley? And I'd say, no, don't bother to. I mean, it's its own thing. It works in its own way. It grew up organically. There's no playbook for it. So why bother? But every place has its own unique assets in engineering, in manufacturing, and in other fields. And every one of those is an opportunity to leverage and then come to the Valley. If there are takeaways, things, ideas that could be imported, learnings, okay, that's great. As we were saying, scale there, attract capital there, partner there, a variety of things. But I think there's a lot of opportunity here in Europe to develop synergistic relationships in the Valley and leverage those to grow here in Europe. So that's my talk. I think there's a lot of really exciting work to be done, a lot of great momentum in Europe, and we look forward to helping those partnerships happen at an even larger scale. Thanks.
Ron, thanks for your call.
I have been looking for this. I've wanted this cookie.
Now you can eat it. Yeah?
Yes,
before
not in front of you, though.
I hope it tastes well. So are there any questions? I think we have time for at least one. No questions so far. Maybe Sean. Here, we have one question. Do we have a microphone?
You talked about Silicon Valley, which is a venture capital financed entrepreneurial ecosystem, but we heard from Trump and Festo, if I'm mispronouncing, I'm sorry, but the German Mittelstand family firms that have extremely deep technology at the atomic and physical level that allows them to create a lot of good jobs for their people, versus the Silicon Valley model, which has been very successful, creates enormous wealth, but concentrated at the top, Mark Zuckerberg. So when we think about the German or the European family firm model, I think we need to respect the deep, and I know you do, but I want to say this as a Californian, the deep social embeddedness and care about the workers that we saw yesterday from the speakers, and also Reinhold. So how do you bring these two different models? But the German model is not an unsuccessful model. I mean, we know. Look at the German economy as a whole compared to our economy. Very successful in Palo Alto and in the Bay Area. But you could go to Detroit and you might not see the same kind of success. So how do we as Americans, and you as Europeans, square these two very successful models?
That's a big question. Well, I think as I was saying at the very end, that there is a lot of potential, actual and potential synergy in the conversation between Silicon Valley and Europe, where there are skills in, say, manufacturing and these kinds of processes, and you could extend that to some employment policies, relationships within companies, where we're not so good. We're not that great at manufacturing, especially the kind of manufacturing that happens here. So there's a lot that we could learn from Europe and from Germany in some of those areas. I think our employment policies tend to be a lot more cutthroat, perhaps, than they are across much of Europe. And I think that, as John Zeisman pointed out yesterday, that's a growing issue as technology accelerates. How do we manage the impacts to ensure, if we can, social stability and equity as its growth happens? So I think that's a really important basis for discussion. Right now, there's somewhat different models, strengths and weaknesses on both, but I think it's a conversation we need to have.
Thank you, Sean.
Great. Thanks, Mark.
So, and we are also very happy to have our next keynote here at the ICE conference, Chukrul Daim, Editor-in-Chief of Transaction of Engineering Management, one of the main journals connected to this community, and also professor at Portland State University and director of the Technology Management Doctoral Program at the university here. And Chukrul is, I think you can already see it when you look at it, this book. He's an expert on technology management and also on the journal. Tukrul, you told me that you will have your talk on various perspectives on technology management, and I'm very happy to learn something more on these perspectives.
Thank you very much. Being an expert on technology management is not an easy job, so I'm not sure if I can claim to be an expert, because the only thing that doesn't change about technology is the uncertainty. So managing uncertainty is key in technology. Like it was indicated, I wear multiple hats today. One representing IEEE transactions on engineering management, one of the top journals in technology and engineering management in the last half century, as well as the flagship journal of IEEE, Technology and Engineering Management Society, which is one of the co-sponsors of this conference. In addition, I'm from Oregon, which is also known as Silicon Forest, another technology center. It is because in the late 70s, several technology companies started moving up north because of the expenses in San Jose Bay Area, and the presence of a company called Tektronix, which was a huge company in the 70s, 80s, then led to a lot of startups in the region. Now Oregon, Portland is home to Intel's biggest site. It's actually its major R&D site in the world, as well as the companies such as Daimler, its headquarters for Nike, US headquarters for Adidas, and many other companies. So, like my colleague said, it's an organic process, and there's multiple perspectives. That's what I would like to talk about today through our research. Now, we have an interesting region, like I was talking about. In addition to technology, the Silicon Forest, the forest comes from trees. We have a lot of trees. It's evergreen trees if you ever come to Portland. Of course, that's because we have a very nice environment, a lot of rivers, and a lot of rain, and we have salmon. Now, what are you going to say? What's the relationship of salmon to technology? There's a very direct relationship. In Northwest, one of the major industry or organizations is related to energy, power sector. It's called Bonneville Power Administration. It's a part of U.S. Department of Energy, and their job is to basically provide power. However, they also run the biggest fish and wildlife program in the U.S., and that's to protect salmon, the wild salmon we have in our rivers. Now, however, even they do that, sometimes when making decisions and when they have to consider multiple perspectives, sometimes people lose sight of things. For example, in the early 2000s, we have had a surge in renewable energy. And again, several agencies in the region were behind that. And we have invited several European companies as well. One of them is, for example, Iberdrola from Spain. And we guaranteed to buy their power. Now, we forgot about the water and the salmon when we did that, because in June and July, right around this time, the snow in the mountains melt, and we have a lot of water. And we cannot just put the water, dump the water over the dams because there's salmon. So we have to generate power because we have passages for fish. And then we tell the Spanish companies to hold on to generate wind power, and we pay them the US tax dollars money for the power that they don't generate. So the reason of this is because we do not look at things from multiple perspectives. So how do you do that? All right. So we, in the US, in the Northwest, created what we call Research Institute for Sustainable Energy. And then what we do is we have created a framework of looking at technologies, evaluating them through multiple perspectives. Okay, and in the case of energy, we looked at 5 perspectives, which is actually a common theory if you look at the literature, looking at technical, economic, environmental, social, and political factors. This really created a framework which we then adopted for different cases. What we do here is we first start by uh, quantifying the model. Now, this is based on what is called a hierarchical decision model. It's a version of analytical hierarchy process, if you're familiar with the multi-criteria decision modeling. And it uses expert judgments quantified through what we call pairwise comparisons. And through that, we measure different, we have different metrics to look at, such as inconsistency, disagreement, so that we make sure that we are getting expert opinions, and we also make sure we get experts before we do these models. Now, the thing to do, I'll just go through the technical details and then go to some of the applications. We start with quantifying the perspectives at the highest level. And then what we do here is we don't just use same experts at every level. It's really mimicking in an industry and an organization, meaning executives or leaders are supposed to know higher levels of priorities, and then you use different levels of experts as you go down, as well as technical experts should be different than economic and environmental. So you're really dissecting the problem and working with groups of experts to evaluate technologies. After that, we again find the criteria weights. And then what we finally do is what we call them desirable to values. They're also called value curves in multi-criteria decision modeling. Try to really convert the metrics to value for the organization who's evaluating these technologies. And the best way to describe that is, I mean, this is, for example, one of the desirability curves for one application, just showing the R&D costs, how desirable, if it's higher or lower, and or some basically qualitative metrics, how that can be again converted to a value. Now, the good example is like the value of a burger when you're hungry. So the value, maybe a burger has a value when you're hungry. Two burgers, the value of two burgers may not be 2 times the value of one burger, and the value of 10 burgers is definitely not equal to the 10 times the value of one burger. So similarly, when you're measuring certain technical aspects of technologies, after one point, it doesn't bring any additional value to the organization. So that's the idea to use the value curves there. And then we put them together, we calculate the technology value, and just as in simple terms, that the value of technologies as a result gives us how basically technologies rank among each other. Now, what this also gives us, before I go to the applications, is the improvement path. So if a technology is valued at 55% of ideal value of 100, basically we could go and pinpoint where we could improve the technology, and I'll give you some examples. Now, as I mentioned in the beginning, we have done a lot of work with Bonneville Power Administration in the recent decade, and we looked at energy efficiency technologies, and this was to evaluate which technologies to push forward from an agency perspective. It just shows you the perspective values as well as the criteria weights. But it was interesting when we looked at it, while the benefits of the technologies, like in terms of savings they provide, was only 50%. It's at the top level of the value, important. And the other important area, almost 50%, was program development as well as market dissemination. And it was, again, this is showing that the perspectives that we should use when you have, for example, lighting, energy efficient lighting technologies, they may have certain efficiency. But if they are not bought, and if you do not have a way of measuring the efficiency a standard way, then you will never basically be able to reach or attain those efficiencies. And it's important for our region because in the last decade or so, I think 80% of the increase in demand, in power demand, was met by energy efficiency programs. So instead of building new plants, the regional entities got together and put these programs, which basically helps you to measure the energy efficiency as well as diffusion of the different devices. This is just showing the results, like LED lighting for commercial offices was the #1, but there were several others, again, uses of different technologies that is creating value. Now, in other application, we use this approach for national technology planning. This was in the Chinese pharmaceutical industry, and I put this to show you that we're not just looking at selection of the technology, but we're also looking at what to do with the technology or how to develop the technology once you identify which technology to go after. So this was, in the case of China, we had certain number of technologies at the top level, which we adopted from another agency. And then we looked at specifically the development strategies and innovation resources by, again, working with the experts in China. One of my former PhD students is from China. And what we found was interesting. The imitative innovation was still considered to be the tool compared to the second preference, which was indigenous innovation, whereas China has been strongly trying to get indigenous innovation. The other one, and again, interesting finding was the small, medium enterprises are thought to be the most, again, effective tool in this case, whereas, again, we have seen China pushing the state-owned enterprises, which was actually rated as the least. We also applied this model to for a decision model for decision making in a technology company, in this case Intel, in their decision to join a standards body. So as you may know, companies, especially in the recent decade or so, they work together to develop standards together. So whether or not it's HDMI, Bluetooth, whatever, generally they put together their heads. I didn't mention that before, but I spent over a decade at Intel myself as well, and my wife works for Intel, so it's Intel. I have a very organic link, and we have worked with one of my former PhD students at Intel in an area where I used to work with. That was the interconnect technology. So, and we looked at the USB case, which was about 25 years ago, plus a general interconnect technology currently. And at the time, I was also a part of the USB team. So we created a model in this case. Okay, so we have economic, strategic, organizational, and legal perspectives, and the decisions can range from not joining to joining and drive. And in this case, for USB, it was indeed confirmed that it was Intel's best interest to join and drive. And even today, any interconnect technology, that would have been the same. Now, as you can see, the applications can be in different areas, and every time there are interesting perspectives. So the last example I'll talk about, it's another one of my former students. We looked at this time adoption of wind technology in the Northwest, and we looked at which policies helped that to be adopted. As you can see, I mean, you can start by selecting the technology, looking at how it should be developed, and then you could also look at what policies are needed to help it to be adopted, given what technology we're looking at, right? So we have adopted the perspectives I had described in the beginning, ranging from economy, social, political, etc. We kind of adopted it for this purpose, and then we identified critical policy elements under each one that will help the adoption. As a result, help basically the economic situation, which will help the adoption of the technology. And then we looked at the policy instruments that were used at the time in Oregon, and by working with, again, government and industry representatives in the region, we were able to identify the criteria weights, meaning, I mean, the weights of the policy elements which carried weight in terms of the adoption. So this was like in the case of USB, this was looking at it from after the fact scenario. And then what we identified, and I'll kind of finish it with this one, when you're looking at the adoption of technologies such as wind, which basically needs a lot of infrastructure, a lot of government involvement, you really need to think about regulations, incentives, and standards at the same time. So when we looked at the 6 tools, so a combination of those for regulation or incentives and standards had the similar weights in terms of their impact on technology. So with that, I'd like to open it up for questions. As you can see, the technology management is not just about technology. It can involve even the fish that we enjoy. So thank you for listening.
Talk and just looking at the time. Is there a question at this moment? Oh yeah, there's one. Yeah.
From the Fraunhofer Fund for Innovation. In Germany at the moment we are discussing how to better implement radical technologies into the innovation system, so-called Stromfinanzierung. Do you have any learnings from the American system that you can share with us?
Well, hi Sven, how are you doing? So it's like my colleague had explained, I think cultural elements play a great role in technology as well. So the entrepreneurship is a part of the American DNA, and that's why you see the success of entrepreneurship in the US, as well as, of course, the region. I always think Stanford and Berkeley being there have been, they have been the greatest reasons. Now, in terms of disruptive technologies, it's interesting. It's now that we're living in a global environment, we will see, I believe that some of these technologies are going to be commercialized in different parts of the world where there are different infrastructures and then come to us. Now, there is an example to that. For example, the cellular phone technology, right? I remember we're talking about almost 25, 26 years ago when I was in the US or kind of traveling back to Germany and whatnot. The landlines were so good that nobody needed the phones. But in Middle East or in China, there was an explosion of cellular phones because of the need, and they kind of got commercialized there first and then here. So I think we see these technologies, especially disruptive technologies, be commercialized in other places because they cannot really break the system in established areas and then come to us later. That's electric car is one of them, for example, that I think will happen the same way. But that's only my opinion, and we'll see how that will work.
Thanks very much, Fergal. Thanks very much
Thank
for being
you for
here.
inviting me. Yes.
Thanks for your talk.
Yeah. Oh, thank you.
So, after the 2 keynotes we had right now, we are going to bring this conference to newer heights, literally. We have with us here Gabriele Mussotta, who is a senior manager at the Daimler Lab 1886. This lab 1886 is about business model innovation, in particular for new mobility solutions. And with her is Stefan Glocke. He is a profiled VC investor, and he has particularly invested in one startup, Volocopter, that is also, or Daimler has also some shares in that startup. And if I would take it not too seriously, you could look at this engagement of Daimler as leapfrogging 2 developments, the electric driving as well as the autonomous driving, and directly going up into the air. So to understand and to see how it works and what the strategy behind that is, please join me on stage, Gabriele Mussotta and Stefan Glocke. So I've learned you brought with us a bit of a movie that actually shows what Volocopter is. We are pretty proud to have that here. It's the next wave of technology revolution in individual mobility, I would say so. And I'm very much curious to hear what part that plays, in particular in terms of the mobility solutions of Daimler. Thanks very much.
I'll give you a short overview about the history of Volocopter. In 2011, two typical German engineers discussed the issue, what do you have to do to scale up a toy drone to make it man-carrying? And this is the result. They did it within 6 to 7 months with a budget of 80,000 euro. And at that beginning, just to prove that it works. After they put a video into YouTube, they had 1 million clicks after 2 days. And the world press was behind them, and that was basically the starting point for the Volocopter. Then they started developing the VC200. That took another, let's say, 3 years for the first flight unmanned in an exhibition hall in Karlsruhe. And then in 2016, we made the first official manned flight with the vehicle that we built in that time. The target till then was basically to build the safest aerial vehicle available, which worked fine. And the business model at that time was really to sell them to private persons, to pilots, and fly around with them. This completely changed a little bit later, but this was kind of historic flight. You see, it's so easy to fly. Anyone here in the room can do it. It's absolutely safe, 18 rotors, of which up to 6 can fail without harming the vehicle in any way. And also you can take off your hands. Try this in a helicopter, or better not. And it's completely silent. It's very silent. It's the sound of the Volocopter is like a big fan. So then the idea came, and we were asked by Dubai to make testing with them on autonomous air taxis. And with those tests that happened last year, the whole issue of Volocopter completely changed. So we started thinking about ecosystems, mobility ecosystems, building up mobile air taxis. And after this success, which is shown in some seconds, you will see that the vehicle also flies completely autonomously. 2017, we did 4 months of intensive testing in the desert of Dubai, which went much better than we anticipated. We thought we have more problems with heat and dust there. And after the 4-month testing, we got permission to fly autonomously within Dubai city airspace. And these flights were then demonstrated to the Crown Prince of Dubai and his uncle, the boss of Emirates, and created basically was a baseline for the 5-year plan of Dubai to introduce autonomous air taxis in their ecosystem. During the same time, we had an investment round of over 30 million euro, and Daimler was part of this. Intel was already a shareholder before that and increased their shares. No, they didn't, they hold the shares, sorry. Now we are targeting the next round, more than 100 million, a Series C round, and for a German startup, this is quite remarkable. What happened after Dubai is that we ramped up the staff. We are now close to 100 people, are able to serve different projects. Especially we want to go for 4 pilots in the next 2 years. Maybe Stuttgart is one of them.
Yeah,
But Singapore and Dubai are at the moment pushing a lot. Talking about ecosystems, this is for our colleague here from Intel, another shareholder of Volocopter. Brian Kazanich was one of the persons who actually flew the Volocopter. He's the CEO of Intel. And he presented the Volocopter on the CES show in Las Vegas last year, beginning of this year. And it looks very easy, but if you know a little bit about aerodynamics, it's the most complicated you can do. Flying a helicopter in a hall with barriers of plexiglass and all the turbulences there. This was an amazing short step. Shortly before the Uber conference, just to tell them, to show them who's the number one in this field, we introduced our ideas of hubs, Volocopter hubs to the world. Basically, the idea is how can a Volocopter manage a lot more people than only the two sitting in there. And we had to think about how more than 10,000 people a day can be moved with a VoloHub. The idea is quite striking. It's the same concept like a ski lift. You have a battery swap included. So the relatively short battery life that we still face of half an hour flight time can be easily compensated with those battery swaps. And at the same time, you also swap the passengers. And it's quite easy to fly off within 2 or 3 minutes then. Since around 1 year, the idea of air taxi has completely changed worldwide. Till then, we had to explain everybody what a Volocopter is and how this could work, and this was like a little bit more than fantasy. But since 1 year, it has completely changed, since we have 70 competitors that we know that are working on the same, including Airbus, Boeing, Embraer, the big aircraft companies, and also the air traffic management system companies like Thales or Deutsche Flugsicherung are working on air traffic management systems over cities. So the idea has changed from if to when. And we see this now also by talking with investors, the climate, investing climate for Volocopter has completely changed within the last 12 months. So I guess there's only a short part, and then I give over to Gabriele to explain a little bit about the intentions why Daimler invested in Volocopter and how perfect our relationship is.
Yeah. Thanks again for the introduction. Thanks for having us here at this conference. You might ask yourself why the vertical segment and why is Daimler engaging in this very thrilling adventure, and why did we as a Daimler AG select Volocopter as our partner in this adventure? Well, first of all, some of you might have arrived here in Stuttgart today, this morning, and we got stuck in traffic jam, pretty much also due to the topography here in Stuttgart. I myself choose to use the public transport in order to arrive in time, because losing time in traffic jam is stressful and you want to arrive in time. And that's why we said, like as Lab 1886, as we are tasked with looking for new mobility solutions beyond and around the car, that we were looking into kind of like new mobility concepts to address our customers for the future. We've started intensively looking into the kind of like competitive activities, what's going on in this kind of like future mobility market. We also know that Elon Musk is pretty much intensely looking into the underground, so looking into mobility underground. We said, well, there's a lot of space in the air. Some of you might have seen the Jetsons in the 60s, where people started flying around in kind of like drones. So we said, well, that's very close to us. That's not vision any longer. So look into this vertical mobility market and look what's going on. Daimler, as you all are aware, is a mobile manufacturer. We are kind of like producing cars, vans, trucks, and buses. So we have all products which will be required to address our customer needs in mobility. We have enriched our portfolio in the past years, in the past 100 years, and recently by mobility services as MyTaxi, Car2Go. We also established Movil, the mobility platform, and have strong partners such as Flexbus and Blacklane and Karim. We have kind of like the task and also the commitment to provide the best mobility solutions to our customers, and that's why we said like we need an integral additional part within urban mobility, and that has been shown here on this very short film. Why did we go for a volocopter? We started looking at that about 2 years ago, and I think that's the time where we met the first time. Volocopter is technology leader in its segment, so they have received the first preliminary permit to fly, manned flight in Bruchsal, and they demonstrated already the first autonomous flight in Dubai, and I think that was a very thrilling experience which we both attended. Volocopter has a very dedicated team. They ramped up their organization in the meantime, and as you mentioned, about 80 to 100 people, and they're very close by to us. And I mean, we all here sitting here, Daimler sitting here in Stuttgart. Volocopter is in Bruchsal, that's very close by, and given that we have engaged in a cooperation, that is, we're going to develop mobility services jointly, we support the team with HR organizational issues. We are kind of like looking into technology links, given that we have a strong expertise in that. It definitely helps to have a partner very close by. So our aim is to kind of like reshape the future, get the pioneers back in, and pioneering this new mobility segment along with a strong partner, Volocopter.
Thanks very much. Very impressive. Thanks very much. I'm really looking forward how that is integrated and what the S-class of Volocopter may look like. So with that, I would like to invite my further panelists onto the stage, and I would like to call another shareholder, obviously, I didn't know that. Intel, Marek Neumann, please, would you join me on stage? Marek is the Senior Director of Business Development for the Automated Driving Group of Intel. So in particular, he is responsible in that for this non-exclusive platform of autonomous driving. Thanks very much. You're joining us, please have a seat. And then I would like to call in Dr. Gabriel Seibert. He has a very strong background in IT services and information technology. Thanks very much for joining us.
Thanks.
He is Managing Director at Accenture Digital and an expert in digital transformation, in particular of the automotive industry. And then last but not least, I would like to call in Alex McKinsey-Torres. He is the VP of Innovation and Business Development for Toyota AI Ventures. Thanks very much for joining us. Thanks very much for being here. All the panelists, you see we've very different views, you know, looking at continents, looking at the layers of the industry. We have expanded our, room of thinking already into the third dimension. And if I may start, Alex, with you, Toyota has shown a pretty impressive, blueprint of an architecture of the future of autonomous driving. How are you looking at those ecosystems, regulatory questions, and in particular, looking at volocopter technology is one aspect, but regulatory affairs, I guess, is a second one.
Well, thank you for the question. Also, thank you for having me over, and thank you for having all these great people around. It's complicated. So when it comes to regulatory terms, it's just not only about having the technology ready, but also to be able to work with the different levels of administration. Like we were discussing beforehand, like in the case of the US, you also need to be very careful because we have different legislations from a federal level and state level. And in the case of Europe, as we all know, there's no unanimity, uniformity in terms of regulation when it comes to AD driving. But the key thing over here is how do you work with local authorities so that you can market your products, and also in the case of Toyota, that we save lives. Because at the end of the day, the regulatory aspect is because you want to launch the best products in the market and you want to launch the safest cars in the market.
Mm. Gabriel, if I may ask you, in particular, the question of safety. It's like moral dilemmas is a lot of the issues that is discussed, how we handle, someone being driven over by a computer, if I just simplify that. How's your view on that if we think about AI and the future of mobility services?
There maybe in the first place, we need to say that there's a lot of advancement in the technology. It's really great what AI can do in the car, and it is basically also the basis for really driving autonomously, which has tremendous success and tremendous advantages if it happens. But also we need to see that there are some pushbacks. So the technology is not as versatile as we hoped. There's a lot of also from these kind of accidents that we've seen in the press, there's this conclusion that the technology behind it, which is basically deep neural networks, that it needs to be trained and that it's kind of an open-ended learning process, which leads to these failures. It's like this kind of black swan theory. It sometimes happens something which you cannot predict, and that might be fatal. And this happened, and it also made the public more aware of that problem, because there was a lot of hype, and everyone, also all the car manufacturers, they said we will be ready with that technology into 2020 or 2025 or something like that. And I was quoted once, and I think this still holds true for me, that we will have autonomous driving cars in broader mass transportation in the same time when we see a man landing on a Mars. And I think this is the similar this time horizon, and it's 2030 or 2040. It's not that far away, but it is some time to go. And especially we need to solve that problem in these neural networks, that they do not have any theory. They're just experimenting, they're learning, and then easy tasks like a 2 or 3 year old child could do, they just simply cannot solve. And this is why there's some kind of, the need is for a mixture of this self-learning technology with some theory-driven technologies, but also there in the realm of AI. It's all there. For example, you have this knowledge representation systems and so on, and we need to combine this in some way in order to preserve as much of the advantages as we can without having all the downsides.
Okay, I see. So, I mean, taking the regulatory side is one. You've tapped into that also in your video already. Infrastructure, Marek, is another question. So we've seen fascinating pieces of technology. One may think about the Transrapid, this German train that never actually took off, even in a country like China that had no infrastructure at the point. So how do you look at, the future of mobility services, autonomous driving, and a question of how that integrates into existing infrastructure? What types of compatibility issues can you see here?
Yeah, I think there's a very broad requirement actually to have interaction with the society in order to support this process and the rulemaking and the bills that are going to be issued, because a lot of the technology that we are very excited about is technology that will face regulation for an age. So what are the acceptable society norms for that? And I would actually add on the requirements of safety that are connected into this. So that's the reason why we decided to start an initiative acronymed with RSS, Responsibility Sensitive Safety, where there are differences between training AI over and over and over again, which there are very cool applications for doing this, but there's a need for a very strong network of rules that you actually can trust on. And that's the reason why we published the papers. They're freely available. We even published pseudocode inviting for broad adoption of that approach, which is very straightforward thinking by setting norms that are characterized acceptable for the transportation and mobility environment, but within these norms also enabling an environment where you're not creating an incident on your own lane, which by the interaction of human beings, the interaction of machines, the interaction of backend networks, communication issues that might come up, disappear, appear, a lot of influences that are non-continuous interacting with the mobility and the traffic as it happens online have to be covered locally, and that provides a provision where we are driving a significant investment, a community investment, which is open to every partner that is interested to link into it, to make sure that we are solving the issue about the real human interaction together with the all-exciting technology that comes with AI and with highly and fully automated environments in public transport.
Okay. Marek, thanks very much. And a lot of what the approach that you just laid out, like publishing pseudocode, inviting people to link in, that the logic behind is very much, sounds to me like more a platform logic, very, very common to, the software and IT industry. just from my side, looking at from the outside to the automotive industry, I think like platform, like for a single company, so non-proprietary platform thinking, and in particular software platform thinking, does not seem to be the natural approach of the incumbents in the automotive industry. Gabriele, if I, may ask that, looking at your activities in, Lab 1886, creating those mobility solutions in the Daimler context, how do you perceive necessary changes to corporate culture, and in particular approaching innovation in terms of the necessity of such kind of platform thinking as Marek just pointed out?
That's a good question. I mean, as Lab 1886, we have the task to look for new solutions. And I think in view of all this kind of like dramatic changes in the automotive industry, we also have to look for joint platforms with partners. So, I mean, things like we are currently discussing how we're going to kind of like join our cooperation with BMW regarding our Drive Now activities. So that's something which you haven't seen 20 years ago. I think that's something completely new. We are also looking into how to integrate different mobility solutions on mobility platforms. That's why we created Move a couple of years ago. So things like what we do need to see is, and I think what's our task here at Lab 1886, given that we do bring these innovations into our company in order to address the need of our customers, we do merge and we do work together with partners internally as well as increasingly externally. And all our activities within Lab 1886 is with partnerships with strong partners such as Volocopter.
Okay. And just, when this mentioned, I know it's kind of difficult to talk about that when the shareholder's right next to you, but I know you're a strong personality, so maybe you can manage. So what is your experience, having a small startup, you just showed how it, started, kind of also went viral, so it was very small in the beginning, and now you've joined with, the big coloss, Daimler. How does that feel and smell and taste?
With Daimler, it was surprisingly fantastic. We defined very soon in the process 6 fields of cooperation. The problem was only that Volocopter did not have enough personnel to fill the projects. So Daimler even sent the people to our side to fill the project. So I think we have a very nice position at Daimler. Whatever we ask for, we get it within days. And probably most of the Daimler subsidiaries would love to be in that position. And Dieter Zetsch is a big fan of Volocopter and a big supporter. And Gabriele and Susanne, they're a perfect match to Volocopter. And we ask for something, we get it.
Perfect. So Alex, you have a long history with Google. Mm-hmm. So you've, subjected yourself to like 2 dimensions of cultural change. So say more software startup. Well, Google is not that much of a startup, but I guess the culture still has a part of that, to an automotive producer, so industry change and cultural change in that, but also from a US more to a Japanese perspective. So what are your experiences there? Is your situation kind of comparable to what Stefan just pointed out?
Yeah, and also adding the factor that I'm European, so I'm half Scottish, half Spaniard. So it's evolving. I'm very happy with all the points that you guys are mentioning, because I also work on the venture capital side on Toyota, and what I discover is, number one, you cannot give the bear hug, as I call it, to the startup. You need to let them do things as they want to do. You need to be very respectful of the executive team. You need to be supportive. You need to be founders ready, and you need to be founders supportive. And it also takes a lot of humility as well to understand that you're not working with suppliers anymore. As my colleague said, I mean, you work with partners. In the past, OEMs were working with suppliers that you would dictate timelines, you would dictate how to do things, but now you need to be humble enough to say, I need to transform into a software company. I need to decide how I'm going to position myself in the market. If I'm going to be a mobility operator, or I'm going to be providing the technology, what do you want to do with that? In my case, it was complicated as well, because it's I was a Google, then I was a Move It, not to be confused with Movell. So I also went to the startup world, but now it's trying to create that type of culture. That's what I'm also trying to do also in Toyota as well. But I think the key thing is to listen and to be respectful, and also to acknowledge that you don't have certain skill set that the big corporation is never going to have. Like in the case of AD, autonomous driving, you're talking about more than 50 different disciplines. And as far as I know, I don't know any OEM who's been good at building software at scale.
I see that. And what's your experience, Gabriel? I mean, you see, you look at the automotive industry as a whole. So I guess you have insights in various companies. So looking at this aspect, so the ability of players in the automotive industry to adapt to the logic of software-driven platforms, also the logic of software-driven product development. How do you perceive the status of the industry, or I guess there are different states? Could you elaborate a bit about it?
It's a very interesting question, of course, and also a very vital question for Germany as a whole, especially also for the region. And yeah, I was looking at this for many years, and there were some waves, ups and downs. And in the beginning, I think there was this narrative that that automotive companies are doomed to go down, to fail, and that no one is interested in mobility anymore. That people rather buy smartphones than cars. And that they're just simply not fancy, and they cannot adapt to this change. And then I think the opposite happened. Then every tech company wanted to build cars suddenly. Apple contemplated building cars, and there was virtually no one who didn't contemplate to move in that phase, in that space. And then the automotive companies, I think they really got in the first wave, they got some kind of in shock, but it wasn't healthy shock. They all went to Silicon Valley, and they all did their studies there, field studies and so on. They came back and they understood what platforms are about and how that business model works. And they did also, especially Daimler, did very early, quite interesting investments. And then they learned. And then I think there's another aspect that helped in that development, that the first wave of internet, I think it was called zero marginal cost internet, where you could music and film, streaming, all that kind, everything that this was virtual was replaced. And then everyone thought, yeah, that the same might happen also to the automotive industry, that everyone will order its cab with smartphone and so on. But now I think we're on the beginning of a second wave, which is probably then called Internet of Things or however, but the haptical is important in that. And this is why also the tech players, Apple was the first and also standing out a little bit, but also the others invested into hardware companies, took over, Google bought hardware companies and so on. They all tried to get into this kind of more haptical field. And in this Internet of Things area, there are different rules. It's not about platforms, not all about platforms. Of course, you can enhance your product with a platform like Apple is doing that, and with ecosystem and so on. But it's not all about scaling. It's not all about zero marginal cost. It's a different game. And currently, the automotive industry suddenly is very good position. The challengers, they scaled down their ambitions or completely stepped out of it. Apple didn't build a car. Google is also struggling a bit, but Waymo is doing quite well. But the others are struggling. Uber is struggling. They're all struggling. And currently, I think the automotive companies are some kind of in a hero position. They learned their lessons. They got back in the game. They initiated all the changes that were necessary. And now I see only one risk, and this risk would be that they feel themselves too calm and say, no, we managed the change. We're through it. Good, well done. But because the real change is coming right now, and this is all about artificial intelligence, and this is where the automotive companies, some in the US did well. They did very large investments, but the Germans didn't so far. So this is where I'm a little bit anxious. And will they master that change as well? If they do, I think they're in a very strong position in this Internet of Things age. If they don't, they might then be exactly like they feared in the first wave. They might be pushed back to some kind of supplier position and not fill this OEM space anymore.
Okay, there's this one aspect that we just tapped into, technology logic, adoption logic in terms of what role automotive and in particular car producers may play in the future. There may be another aspect if we think about governance of mobility, in particular inner city mobility governance. I mean, today city governments, lay out roads, and everybody can decide, to use whatever vehicle to drive on that. Some cities in the world show very well that approach kind of does not really, manage the challenges we have. If you've ever been to Beijing or Mexico City and so on, they're very obvious. Munich is getting somewhere close to that now. So, Marek, what are your thoughts on that? So, if we consider that that city governments may take over a deeper role, if you think about layers of value in inner city mobility, that the governance is more stricter, limiting what type of vehicles are allowed to enter inner cities, that this inner city mobility is kind of de-individualized. What is the role of platforms, car manufacturers, autonomous vehicle, AI logic in that? How do you look at that?
I think we will observe a transition. So there's not a black and white and somebody's pulling over a switch. What we expect to see, and you called out a few cities, actually there is an ongoing discussion in Singapore about limiting the number of plates that have been deployed already to the current state and not allowing more individual vehicles to be registered, as there are other approaches in Paris where certain end digits are allowed for certain days crossing specific city areas. That's the beginning of a transformation of the individual mobility. I carefully say the real trick is going to be how that properly integrates in a socially acceptable society positive way into a mobility concept of the future. And that involves a lot of infrastructure that is very interesting to us as the nature of our business. I don't think the rules have already been written, to be very honest and upfront. We do see startups actually pushing with very smart ideas into these markets. We do see the incumbent developing strategies that are built on their natural strengths by having huge populations out there in terms of technology. And we do see cities starting to identify these challenges as new opportunities of income, which needs to be at an acceptable level. London has delivered an example with the fees for actually entering London downtown. There was a lot of argument that this would never happen and never would sustain. Actually, it's out there since quite a few years. So I think as a society, we have to be prepared for these kind of changes. In terms of technology, it opens a complete new opportunity to deliver better service, better experience, and make people spending time on more useful things than actually lining up in traffic jams and standing in lines for subway access or other things. We just waste our time these days.
I certainly agree to that. I mean, I've been in San Diego for 9 months, and when I came back and was in Munich again, I thought I was back in Los Angeles. Alex, if I may ask you, I mean, you've showcased a software architecture for the future of autonomous driving at the occasion of the CES beginning of this year. If I can remember correctly, you were part of that, or Amazon. I guess I'm almost right and almost wrong, but can you point out a bit what type of or what kind of considerations are behind in terms of that, envisioning of the future of governance of inner city mobility that is kind of coded into that platform idea and architecture?
In the case of Toyota, I mean, number one, we're trying to work with different players, mostly from startups. That's where the innovation is coming from. Number two, the idea that you mentioned is more of like a multi-platform called the Palette. It would have different type of use cases depending on the needs of the customer. It could be like place like there's ideas for hotels, for restaurant, or everything in the mobility side. The key question over here, and also when it comes to AD, is also to understand what the user is going to need at the end. Is it a question of, as we were saying, is it a question to saving times when you're in a traffic jam? Is it a question of congestion? Also, one of the things that Movell is doing very nicely in Germany, how do you work with local authorities in order to understand what their pain points are? So in Toyota, we're trying to do it in different angles, but also on the software architecture and also on the AD side, just to understand, number one, as you were saying, Gabriel, what are the different technologies that we need to build so that we have the best architecture so that there's no problems in terms of safety. Because most of the times what happens is that people say, as we were saying all together, oh, we want to have autonomous driving in X amount of time. I also agree with you about the commitment. I mean, also the Toyota materials that you have for outside consumption, we don't commit with timelines because it's an unknown. The technology is an unknown. We know that there's still a long way to go. We have prototypes, we're launching. We know that there are different cases, platforms, but you need to be humble enough to say, I need to learn from academia, and I need to say, I need to build in this way or the other direction for the best reliable and safe solution.
Okay. Thanks very much. And at this point, I would just give the opportunity to the audience if there's to go.
I've got a question because this is what we discussed in our classes. So as you mentioned, there's going to be a lot of social, financial infrastructure changes. So the two that come to my mind, one is the insurance. So in the US, for example, everybody's insured for their cars and whatnot. Who's going to be insured? Is it going to be Daimler because they are manufacturing cars, or us, but we're not driving, right? And the second is also about financial. You mentioned the cities and how they make revenue, but a lot of cities in the US are struggling today because they are getting a lot of revenue through parking houses, which is going to go away because you can just sell your car to go somewhere else and then come back when you're done. So any thoughts on those areas?
Maybe I just start with the infrastructure because we discussed that in our department recently. I think when all this kind of like parking houses will go away, they will provide space for living, and all the cities need space for living and they need to be attractive. So I think nobody will kind of like miss those parking garages. And I think what will happen now in the future is that the kind of like the vehicle manufacturers such as Daimler will work very closely with the cities because cities are also our customers. They're responsible for providing integrated transport solutions to the customers. So I think there will be some kind of like a further strengthening of the partnership and as such social governance. Regarding the assurance program, I think that still needs to be discussed, and I think that's one of the many questions that will be addressed in the near future.
Maybe you have time for one other question. Is there one here? Then I would like to end around, thanks very much, with one question to you, Gabriel. I mean, you said we are going to have autonomous driving at the same year where we have the first man on Mars. So when do we have third dimension taxis in the air? Which type of planet do we need to conquer at that year too?
Yeah, that is an interesting one because if you look to all these older science fiction movies, all the cars were flying. So it was, if you had a question, how would the future look like? You know, everyone would say flying. Today it's totally different. No one is flying. Elon Musk is thinking about going under the ground. That will be very interesting, but I think your business case is sound, and it's very interesting also the movie that we've seen. I think there will be a third dimension, probably not in mass transportation. Yeah, then we will see. Exactly. But I think also in specific cities, like the ones you had in the movie, I think this will be a very interesting scenario, and I would buy a room in the top of this building and have my volocopter there. And so probably it will be Dubai. I don't know. Planet will be Earth and city will be Dubai.
Thanks very much. Brilliant. Please give a hand of applause to our... And thanks very much, Gabriele, for joining us here. We have a little bit of a present for you. Alex, thanks very much for joining. I know you are small on your baggage, but if it is exceeding weight limits, you can eat it. That's the analogy. Thanks very much for joining. Stefan, thanks very much for being here. And Marek, thanks very much for joining us, and thanks for your insights. Please give a hand of applause to our mobility panel. Thanks very much.